welcome to the second video in this 4-part web scraping series, which is going to teach you how to do both the front end and the back end web scrape and then display your beautiful web scrapings on a web page using Flask. So there's going to be 6 easy steps in part 2. You might want to pause the screen if you're an advanced developer and you're going to get through this really quickly, and these are the steps. So first we find a website that we want to scrape. And we're going to begin in this video with something relatively simple so you understand the concept. And then we'll do the coronavirus one and we'll get on to something more interesting. You're going to analyze it using something called inspect element in the browser. We're going to do some coding in our webscraper.py file that we made in the previous video, write some basic scraping commands, pass the data to our HTML page, and we're going to view our page, which should have our scraped data on it. So let's get started with that. Now again, if you're an advanced user and you want to skip ahead, you don't want to listen to me talk through the various steps and explain everything, you could just pause the screen here as I show you this screen. This is what we're going to basically be doing. There are 3 steps or 3 bits of code that we're going to be adding to webscraper.py. And then we're going to be passing that data and just adding those 2 bits there to the HTML. So let's get started. Now to begin with, we need to open up our Sublime text that we were working on in the previous video. We had this file here, which is webscraper.py and the home.html. So we're going to start with coding over here to fill this up, and then we will actually look at a website that we'd like to scrape and see how that works. So the first thing, remember in the previous video we downloaded or we sort of installed all the dependencies that we needed, and one of those, the main one, was something called Beautiful Soup. It is worth looking it up and reading the documentation for yourself, where you can actually learn how to use it for yourself. But for now, let us just, underneath here where it says app equals Flask, let's type in from BS4, which is Beautiful Soup 4, import Beautiful Soup. And then let's also go import requests, because remember that's one of the dependencies that we installed in the last video. So import requests, that's great. These 2 things have been done and we can now move on. So what we're now going to do is we're going to set up the source for the website that we'd like to scrape. So if I type in source equals to requests, we're using that requests up there, .get, and I set this up with 2 little speech marks there, and actually add a text. It's going to turn into text the URL that I'm going to look for. In here, we're going to put in the URL of something that I would like to scrape. Now I'm going to use a really an existing site which kind of like is set up to be scraped for beginners. So let's start with this and let me show you what it looks like. So I've typed in that URL and I'm going to open it here. So someone set up the site, obviously expecting people to scrape this site, and you can see how it looks. We're going to analyze this now using the inspect tool in the browser, which is going to be extremely handy. In fact, if you've come across any HTML or done any front-end development, you would have used it already. Now, you don't need to be an absolute front-end sort of HTML expert to be able to web scrape, but what you do need is you need to know some basic facts about HTML and how it works, and also how websites work, professional industry websites. The first thing you need to know about websites is that they're all created in HTML. Now, HTML is just a markup language. It's not really a programming language like Python or Java. It's a markup language. And HTML has tags. They have these little triangular tags. So every HTML document starts with an HTML like that, and it ends with the same, with a / HTML. And it has loads of tags like that. You have things like style tags, you have strong tags to make the text bold, etc. H1 tags for headings, P tags for paragraphs. The third thing is that tags can have attributes, as I'll show you in a minute. And also tags can be nested. Now look at this. This is a little HTML sort of command, so to speak, and you can see that Python is inside these EM tags, which make it turn the text into italics. So you can see that Python has been turned into italics. However, outside Python and students are these strong tags, and this turns it into bold. So you can see that Python students is bold, but just the word Python, just the string Python, is in italics. So these 4 things are useful to keep in mind. And now let's have a look at the site. So here is quotestoscrape.com. If you right click on the page and you click on inspect, or Control-Shift-L depending on what machine you're in, it comes up with something on the right. It might come up on the bottom, but you can change where you want it to be. And basically, if you click on this little tiny arrow here, which says select an element in the page to inspect it, it does exactly that. So you click on that arrow, and when you hover over any element in this web page, on the right hand side, it gives you the corresponding code, which for HTML is going to be tags and attributes that you can analyze. In fact, you can even change it, but you're only changing it in the browser, not actually anywhere else. So I'll demonstrate that to you. I can click on this and I can sort of edit as HTML, and I can change this to being naughty and changing this sort of thing. And it changes it only in the browser, so it's not changing it on the actual website. But you can really experiment with websites and see how they work, analyze their CSS and their structure. Now, most good websites have a consistent structure. So in other words, you don't want this quote to be in a different font and then this one to be in a completely different font or style. Usually any website that you can think of, like a news site or Amazon, has everything in a similar consistent structure. And this is really helpful for web scraping because you can analyze the patterns. Now, for the purposes of this video, we're just going to do something simple. I would like to scrape these quotes. So if I click on the arrow and I click over the quote there, I can see immediately that every quote seems to be, just move this across, make that bigger for you, seems to be in this div class called quote. And if I then hover over the author, which we might want as well, Albert Einstein was the author, apparently, of this quote, you can see that it also, if you hover to the right there, is in a small class. So it's not a div class, but a small class. And it's in these sort of, well, it says in speech marks, author. So this is useful information. You're analyzing it, you're seeing what you need, and then we're going to get back into the code to scrape this website. And we're going to scrape it for the quote and the author. So hopefully this will make sense now that you've analyzed the HTML and you know what we're looking for. So now that we've analyzed the site, we're going to come back to our webscraper.py file and we're going to do some coding. So remember, we added these 2 lines of code, which are importing Beautiful Soup. Beautiful Soup is this sort of clever library which allows us to work with commands to do with web scraping, and requests. And here we've used requests to actually get the URL that we are looking to scrape. Underneath that, we're going to create what's called a soup object. Now, the soup object is going to allow us to work with Beautiful Soup in various ways. So if you've studied object-oriented programming, you know that an object basically inherits all the attributes and the methods of its parent class. So in this case, we're creating a soup object. It magically contains all the methods, all the attributes, everything that we need essentially to web scrape. So a Beautiful Soup, and we're going to set the source, and we're going to be using this XML. There's different things that you can use, but this is what we've chosen for this video. Now, the first thing that I'd like to isolate is the quote. So I'm going to set up a variable. I could call it anything I like, but I'm just going to call it quote. And I'm going to say soups. I'm using that soup object that I've just created. Mind you, you can call it anything you like. In the next video, I might call it something different, just to illustrate that. But so soup.find, and then remember we've noticed the div, and we noticed that the class that we were analyzing for quote happened to be called quote. So if I just type in that, now you can see that this has turned pink, which is suggesting to me that there's an error in the code. And the reason for that is this is a reserved word in Python, so I need to add in a little underscore there, which will get rid of that. And what we're saying basically is find anything in that page, in the URL that we've specified, which has a div class of quote. So let's go on to the next bit. We're now going to say, now if I printed this out, which I'm not going to do now, but just take my word for it, if I printed it out, it would print all of this with the tags around it, and that's not what we want. So we want to isolate just the text of the quote. So if I create another variable here called quote text, and then remember it was in the span, so I'm just going to say span.text, oops, and again you can just type this in as it is. That should get for me the quote and just the text bit of the quote. Let's do exactly the same thing for author. So I set up a variable called author. It's following a similar sort of style here, format, but this time it was a small class, wasn't it? So small class underscore, oops, underscore equals, and obviously it was in the little ID there called author. So this is going to find effectively find the first author, and I'll come back as we go through the videos. You'll understand everything about how you can find lots of you can go through and loop through all of them, but for now all we're really doing is it finds the first quote and it finds the first author. And then I want to do the same thing, so I want to return the author text, not the whole thing with the tags, so I just go author.text. I don't know why it's sort of helping me there by adding something I don't want. So author.text. Now if I save this, that's fine. I've isolated the author text and the quote text, but I'm not doing anything with it. I'd like to actually present this or display it on my web page. Now you can just Control B and you can actually run to see what is happening if you want to test this. So say I said quote text here and print say author text. You could then run the Python file using idle or even Sublime Text, and you could see what is contained in it for testing purposes. But for now, what we want to do is pass it to the HTML page, and we do that like we did in the Flask videos, very simply. For now, not particularly best practices, but just simple. We just go author text. Let's start with quote text actually. So quote text, oops, and then we have author text, passing that through as well. So we have now passed these variables to our template via this route, this home route. So obviously at this point we need to update our home.html page, and somehow, somewhere in here, we need to actually put in those variables that we've passed, and we're going to be using Ginger. Again, I'm not going to explain this. You can watch the Flask series for this, but it should be fairly obvious what we're doing. So down here is where I would like, I'm going to add a little break there. That's a break tag. I would like to add the quote, and I would like to also display the author. So to do that, you add some paragraph tags. I'm just going to copy and paste that. Oops. And in between, let's have a little break between them. So in between these paragraph tags, I'm going to add the quote text. And notice that I've used 2 curly braces on that side, 2 curly braces Ginger to display. It's very, very simple. And I do exactly the same thing for author text. Now, if I save all, actually, because I'm going to save both these files, I should be able to run my server and see that the scraping that I have done in the back end is now displayed on the front end. So let's have a look. So let's go back to the beginning, remind you how to do this. Open up your command prompt, you go back into the directory where your folder is. I never remember, so I'm just going to type in dir. Yep, so then I'm going to change directory cd into my project. In my project is where, let's move this here so you can see it. In my project, in fact, let me CLS there. So in my project is where the virtual environment is. I can prove that by saying dir, and you can see it there. I need to now enter into this virtual environment. Remember, you're just going to get used to doing this again and again. Habit. I'm now in my virtual environment. I need to get into the next folder, remember, which is Webscraper. So CLS to clear the screen. So cd Webscraper. In the Webscraper folder, I have webscraper.py. I'm ready to run the server webscraper.py. It's not coming up with any errors. It would otherwise. It is running the server. Let's see what happens. So if I go back, you can see that it has successfully scraped, and this is really exciting, but it gets even more exciting. Our first web scrape, it has gotten you the quote and the author, but only the first one. So we're going to move on from here to see the different things you can do now. Getting integers and working with them, doing cool things in Python using for loops. You're going to really learn a lot. So in this video, we actually looked at how to web scrape and place something on the front end. But in the next video, we're going to come back to the coronavirus Avi Schiffman that I mentioned, and how he produced this sort of pretty simple site, which was tracking and actually scraping data of COVID results. Now, here's another site, and he actually turned down, like I mentioned, an 8 million offer. You can go on his Twitter, you can read about why he did that, how the site was making money, or why he got the offer in the first place for such a relatively simple site. So you go to his homepage there, which again is very, very basic. And here's the coronavirus dashboard. So we're going to be looking in the next video at how to scrape results for coronavirus and pretty much set up something like this, at the starter of something like this, and you'd be able to develop it as you see fit. But before we do that, I'm not going to actually do this in Sublime Text, but I want to show you two things. Now, if you want to play around with Python code in the context of Beautiful Soup, you can use what's called trinket.io/Python and do exactly the same thing. You can import BS4, all these things, and you can actually sort of play around with data before actually putting it into your Sublime Text and your whole application. This is an example that I've done, but the second thing I wanted to tell you about was a site called Stack Overflow. So let me get started with a small example. This is not part of the actual project, but in the next project, we're going to actually create in your Sublime Text and on your Flask front end the web scraping of a coronavirus stats site. So we're going to take a quick look at how you can use this site, this wonderful site called Stack Overflow, which I use a lot if I have a question or if I'm stuck with something and your mom or dad or whoever you live with, your husband or your wife or your girlfriend, I don't know, can't help you. Well, who do you go to? Well, Stack Overflow is full of professionals and people who are really, really got the expertise to help you, but you've got to be able to ask the question in the right way. And I remember starting off with Stack Overflow and asking a question, and you get downvoted and people scold you, and it can be very demoralizing. So let's have a look at how we can ask a question, format it correctly, and get a good response, if we get a response. So the question I have is related to what we're doing. So the site that we're looking at is this coronavirus, it's called Worldometers, and it actually gives you an updated, this changes dynamically, coronavirus cases, worldwide, deaths, recovered, etc. So I'm going to copy that, and I've put it in there, and ignore this for a minute. And literally all that's happening is exactly the same thing. We set up an object, and we are looking to find every single thing that is contained within wherever we find this main counter number. And the reason for that is if I go down here and inspect and I hover over these three numbers, it's not quite working there. There we are. You can see that the div class there, the div class is main counter number, in which all these numbers are stored. There are three of them. So if we go back here, this is a variable called data, which is basically getting all this information these three things, these three numbers, wherever the div class is equal to main counter number. So if I run the code now, that point over here, print data, what it does is it prints out all this stuff. And that's just, you know, it's got all the span tags and the things, and I don't want that. I just want the number. I just want 11227, I want the 529. So how do I do that? And also, what if I just wanted this bit, the total cases? I didn't want the recovered cases or the total deaths. So first of all, if I made another variable called total cases equals data 0, what that does, and you can see it's down here, it's printed down here, is it gives me the first one. And if you think of it like an array, so if I change that to 2, there's only 3, so if I change that to 2, that would give me the third one, because it's 0, 1, 2. If I change that to 1, it would give me this number. And that's great. And basically, how did I make it return this without all the tags and everything else? Well, I just added this dot text. So I said total cases equal to data 0, which gives me the first element, dot text, which strips it away of all the tags using Beautiful Soup. But then, this is where my question is. I print the total cases, which is great, and then I use a strip command. Total underscore stripped, this is another variable, and I'm stripping this, but nothing is actually happening that I can see. It looks exactly the same. So my question is there a difference, or what exactly does strip do in this case? So how do I ask that question? This is how. So I'm going to copy and paste this whole code, and I go to Stack Overflow. Now I have an account, so you sign up for an account, and then you find the place where it says Ask Question. So here we are in the Ask Question. Now you've got to make your title, it tells you, be as specific as possible. And my question is basically, what exactly does the split command do? Example from Beautiful Soup and web scraping. And then I go down here to the body, and I'm going to ask my question, but I'm also going to paste my code. And this is really important because they're quite specific and picky about the way that you format code. So first, if I ask the question, I say, I have the following code. And have extracted the text only, getting rid of the tags using .text. Tutorials and documentation suggest using .split as well, but I cannot see the difference. What does split actually do in this case? I'm going to now paste in my code, which is here. And actually, you don't really need all of that. So they might, if you put in code which is not relevant to the question, they get a little bit annoyed, so I'm going to delete that. But this gives the context well. So now what I do is I highlight all of that, and I say Control K. So you press Control and K on your machine, and what that does is it turns into code, which is the proper way in which you're meant to format questions on Stack Overflow. So there's the question. What does the split actually do in this case? And here it is. Right? And then I can clarify, I can say, as far as I can see, this command produces the same output as the first total cases without the strip applied. And then if I go back, I could just say that. And then you put in the tags that are relevant. So I'm trying to say Beautiful Soup. It sort of gives you the tags that might be relevant, including strip command, and of course Python. And then you review your question and post it. So what you do is you keep refreshing, and you're hoping for an answer, and you can see how many times your question's been viewed, and oh no, this question has been downvoted. So someone has thought it is not a very good question. And this is great because for demonstration purposes I can explain that if you ask a question that has already been asked on Stack Overflow, you will be downvoted. And it's likely that the split command is actually a question that has been asked. Having said that, I can see in my inbox that 2 people have replied. So I've got one answer, and you can either accept an answer or you can upvote an answer. But I've also have a comment, which is probably going to be something insulting. So the comment says, your question asks the purpose of the split command, while your question body is asking for the strip command. You don't use split, you're using strip. And so, I mean, to begin with, I've made a mistake. So people get really angry here. So I'm not asking about split, I am asking about strip. So this is good. I can show you how you can edit your question. You go back to edit, and you change it to split. Sorry, strip rather. Because that's what I'm trying to do. Strip, strip, strip down there, and then you can say made a mistake, changed, I meant strip, and then save your edits. So that's great, but I can see up here that someone has actually answered my question as well. So down here, someone has suggested, a very kind person called AJ, has said strip removes the starting and ending extra spaces in the text. There's R strip and L strip. 2, which removes the spaces on the defined side. Now R and L, so L is like the leading and R is the other side of that. So strip is not part of Beautiful Soup, and in the title you have mentioned as split, but description has strip. So he's sort of told me off for my bad question, but he's also answered the question, and that's great. So what I can do is I can upvote him and I can accept this as an answer, which I can't do now. So anyway, this gives you an idea of how you can use Stack Overflow to ask questions. It also gives you an idea of a bad question. I probably got downvoted because I asked it badly, but also you would get downvoted if you ask a question that already exists. But it does show you the sort of format that you should have, make it as explicit and as clear as possible, and you should be able to get answers from professionals who are wanting to help. Now, why do they want to help? Because they get upvoted, and then they get what's called a reputation point here. So this guy actually only has 16. You can see that I have 1,197. The person who commented has 423, etc. So the more questions you answer, or if you ask really good questions that people upvote and use a lot, then you will get upvoted and your reputation will increase, your reputation points. So that's how you use Stack Overflow, an invaluable resource. So as we go into the next video, you're going to have to know a few Python programming concepts. So if you've not done any Python at all, you might want to go and do our introduction to computing and Python programming, which is going to give you pretty much all the basics that you need to know. And there are additional videos that can get you to grips with some of the things on the screen. Having said that, even if you don't, you can follow along, and I'm going to give you some basic information. So the 4 things that you'd need to know. The first one are arrays and how they work in Python. Now, an array, without me going into it too deeply, just think of it like this. You have a box of different values, lots of values at 20, 33, 12, and each of these values has an index number. In Python, in different languages it's different, but in Python the indexes start at 0. So if I said to you, if the name of this array was called numbers, numbers 1 holds the value 33, numbers 4 holds the value 19, and so on. So it's very simple, nothing too demanding for you to understand. The second thing is these 3 different commands, .text, .strip, and .replace. And they're going to be really, really important in working with strings. Now, web scraping is effectively scraping stuff off the web, and you scrape it. When you scrape it, you get it in string, which is text format. and you need to be able to do things with it. .text actually just strips it of all its different tags. .strip, as we looked at in the Stack Overflow, strips it of spaces. So again, if you're not sure of something, look it up, or Stack Overflow it. And .replace is very, very important. You can actually replace any tiny sort of character inside the string with something else, and you'll see why that's important as we do the coronavirus scraping in the next video. Finally, there's something called casting. Now, in the video series that I do for Introduction to Programming, this is explained very beautifully, but to put it simply, every single bit of data has a type, just like how we have a type. Now, when we think of the word casting, we think of casting a spell, which I'm against, or you think of sort of fairy tales where you have a frog where a spell is cast on them and they change into something different, like a prince. And in the same way, you have data which has types. It can be a string, it can be an integer, it can be a float, and you need to know what you're working with. Now, suppose I extracted this information, this 11,000, or this big number, which I'm not going to try and say, and I extracted it and I put it into a variable. That variable, if it is a string variable, you can't actually do mathematics with it. I couldn't multiply it or find a percentage from it. So I'd need to actually cast it into an integer. And that's what casting is, and that's what we're going to be looking at in the next video as well. So the next video, very quickly, we're going to be set up and web scraping a coronavirus site, Worldometer, to produce something like what Avi Schiffman did.